Dean Brennan stood before his woodpile in the February dawn, counting. 63 cords remained, stacked with the precision of a man who understood survival. 63 days until April thaw, not one piece to spare. Papa, how many warm nights we got left? Thomas appeared in the cabin doorway, still in his nightshirt, breath misting in the cold. 7 years old and already learning to read the wood like a calendar, just as Dean had taught him. Enough, son. Just enough. Dean ran his hand along the frozen bark. Each cord represented careful planning. Hard labor from last summer's cutting. Mathematical certainty in an uncertain world. He'd learned early that frontier life forgave no miscalculation. Restocked. A man provided for his family, or he failed them. Simple as that. They ate cornmeal mush by the fire. Thomas practicing his letters on a slate between bites. The boy formed each character with careful concentration, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth. Dean watched with quiet pride mixed with old regret. Pie. His own education had ended at 9 when his father died. Leaving him to work, he could read now. Taught himself with his mother's Bible. But figures still confounded him. He counted on his fingers for anything beyond simple sums. Thomas would have better. Dean had promised that the day the boy was born. You remember your multiplication today, Dean said. Wrapping a scarf around his son's neck, Miss Colton says you got a gift for numbers. I'll remember. Thomas pulled on his coat, already patched twice. We're learning to group them. Make big numbers from little ones. Dean watched from the doorway as Thomas trudged through the snow toward the schoolhouse a half-mile. Distant. The building sat small against the white landscape. Smoke rising thin from its chimney. Something about that smoke nagged at him. Seemed thinner than usual. Less robust. He turned back to his chores. Not his problem to solve. The day passed in the rhythm of winter work. Mending harnesses. Splitting kindling. Melting snow for the animals. Dean worked with his hands and thought about multiplication, making big things from little ones. There was a poetry to that his son understood better than he did. Inside. He added wood to the fire. Careful to use only what was needed. The cabin held his life in simple inventory. His late wife's quilt on the bed. Faded but clean. Her coffee cup he still used each morning. A small shelf of books Thomas was learning to read. Everything counted. Nothing wasted. That night, Dean taught Thomas to count the woodpile by lamplight, pointing through the frosted window. Each cord tells you something. Sun tells you how many nights you can sleep warm. How many mornings you wake up safe. That's arithmetic that matters. Thomas nodded. Already drowsy. I like the multiplication better. Papa, more interesting. Dean smiled and tucked the quilt around his boy. More interesting. Maybe that was the difference between surviving and thriving. Between his childhood and his son's future. Outside. The schoolhouse chimney smoke had stopped entirely. Dean noticed it just before bed, a dark shape against the stars where light should glow. He frowned, then closed the shutters. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Thomas burst through the cabin door 3 hours before he should have. Cheeks blazing red from cold, eyes bright with confused tears. Papa, school's closed. We gotta come home. Dean dropped the harness he was mending. Closed. What happened? No more firewood. Ere Thomas's voice cracked. Miss Colton said the schoolhouse ran out. She sent us all home until more comes. Dean knelt to his son's level, placed rough hands on small shoulders. The boy was shivering. but not just from cold. Something deeper trembled there. And when's more coming? She doesn't know. The town council meets next month. The supply wagon's not due till late March. Thomas wiped his eyes with his sleeve. We were learning multiplication. Papa. I was just starting to understand it. The words hit Dean harder than they should have. Just starting to understand. The phrase carried the weight of doors opening. Possibilities expanding. A mind catching fire with knowledge. And now those doors slammed shut because nobody had thought to keep the schoolhouse warm. Tell me about Miss Colton. Thomas brightened slightly. She's real smart. Papa came from St. Louis last fall. She knows everything about numbers and reading and geography. Today she was teaching us how multiplication works with grouping, and I could see it. Papa, I could see how the numbers fit together. The boy's hands moved as he spoke, forming invisible patterns in the air. She gave her shawl to little Emma Garrett. Thomas continued. Emma was crying from the cold. Miss Colton's hands were shaking when she told us school was closing, but she promised we'd start again soon as Firewood arrived. Dean stood slowly, walked to the window. 20 children sent home. 20 futures interrupted because of cordwood and poor planning. You go warm yourself by the fire. I'll get supper started. But Dean didn't move toward the stove. He stood at the window, looking at his woodpile. Thomas watched from inside. Small face pressed against the frosted glass. The boy had said it himself, just starting to understand. Those were the most dangerous words, the most precious. Understanding was the crack that let light into darkness. Dean knew that crack. Well, he'd spent his whole life trying to wedge it wider. Teaching himself to read by lamplight, struggling with calculations that came easy to other men. His son wouldn't struggle. His son had gifts Dean had never possessed. Dean stepped outside, placed both hands on the stacked cords. 63 days to April thaw. The arithmetic was simple, brutal, but simple. Behind him, through the window, Thomas waited. Thomas slept fitfully that night, coughing once from the cold. He'd caught walking home early. Dean sat at the kitchen table long after the boy's breathing steadied, a stub of pencil in his hand and paper spread before him. The lamplight flickered across numbers he'd scratched out and rewritten. Mathematics of survival versus mathematics of something else. Something harder to calculate. He remembered being 9 years old, sitting in a land office while men discussed a property deed. They'd spoken in terms he couldn't follow. Percentages. Compound interest. Acreage calculations. He'd signed with an X and lost money on the deal. The shame had burned for years. At 15. He'd marked a loan document the same way, not understanding the terms. Paid 3 times what he should have. By 20. He'd taught himself to read, but numbers remained slippery things. He could count cattle and measure fence posts, but complex arithmetic danced beyond his grasp. It had cost him opportunities, dignity, advancement. Every door that required education had closed in his face. His son would walk through those doors. Dean had sworn it. He stared at his calculations. Half his woodpile would heat the schoolhouse through March, 6 weeks of education for 20 children. The school would survive. The question was whether his cabin would. Dean's pencil moved across the paper. At half rations. Burning less. Closing off the bedroom. Wearing every layer they owned. Going to bed earlier to conserve heat. Yes. Possible. Barely. But possible. They could make it to April if the weather held. If the weather held. Montana weather held for no man. But Thomas had said it. Just starting to understand multiplication. The boy had a gift for grouping numbers. Seeing patterns Dean couldn't see. Miss Colton had noticed. That meant something. Dean thought of the schoolhouse. Dark and cold. A building without warmth was just wood and nails. Useless. A school needed fire to become itself. Knowledge required warmth to take root. He walked to the window. Looked out at the sleeping world. The schoolhouse sat invisible in the darkness, but he knew exactly where it stood. Half a mile of frozen ground between his cabin and that empty hearth. 20 children waiting. His son waiting. A teacher who'd given her own shawl to keep a child warm. Dean folded the paper with his calculations. Tucked it into his pocket. The numbers were clear enough. Survive or sacrifice. Protect your own, or invest in something larger. But there was another arithmetic. Harder to write down. The mathematics of what a man leaves behind. His son's future weighed against 6 weeks of cold. His son's education weighed against his own comfort. We'll manage, Dean whispered to the quiet cabin. He pulled on his coat, his gloves, his hat. The decision had already made itself. Really. Had made itself the moment Thomas said those words. Just starting to understand. A man who denied his son understanding to spare himself discomfort wasn't much of a man. In Fuanerquanai, Dean moved toward the door. Toward the woodpile. Toward a choice that felt less like choosing and more like accepting what had always been true. His son would learn multiplication. Whatever it cost. Dean worked in darkness, loading his wagon by moonlight. The wood clunked softly as he stacked it, each cord a small sacrifice building toward a larger faith. He counted as he worked. 30 cords, half his carefully hoarded supply. His breath steamed in the frozen air above him. Stars burned cold and distant. No witnesses except the sleeping town and his own conscience. The wagon groaned under the weight as he hitched the horses. They stamped and snorted. Unhappy at the pre-dawn disturbance, Dean murmured low words, calming them, then climbed onto the seat. The ride to the schoolhouse took 20 minutes, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough to reconsider, long enough to turn back. He didn't turn back. Behind the schoolhouse, Dean unloaded in careful silence. He stacked the wood in neat ricks against the wall. Precise as always, even in giving. He maintained dignity through craftsmanship, each piece placed deliberately. No wasted motion. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when he finished. Dean stood back, surveying his work. Enough to last 6 weeks, maybe 7 if used wisely. Enough to carry 20 children through to spring. Us them are Brennan. He turned. Sarah Colton stood at the corner of the building, wrapped in her coat, eyes wide with shock. She was younger than he'd imagined from Thomas's descriptions. Mid-20s, city-bred but frontier toughened. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, her face sharp with cold and surprise. Miss Colton, Dean touched his hat brim. What? She moved closer, staring at the stacked wood. Mr. Brennan, this is how did you... Should last till spring. He interrupted gently. If you're careful with it. But what about your own hearth? Thomas said you count every cord. That you plan exactly. We'll manage. Sarah's hand went to her throat. Mr. Brennan, I can't accept this. Not if it means you and Thomas will suffer. Dean met her eyes steadily. Oh, boys got one chance at learning multiplication. Miss Colton, one chance to understand numbers the way I never could. That's worth being cold for a spell. But you gave your shawl to Emma Garrett yesterday. Thomas told me. You were shaking from cold yourself. But you gave what you had. Dean gestured at the wood. This is the same thing, just bigger. Sarah's eyes filled. She blinked hard, composing herself. You're a remarkable man. Mr. Brennan, I'm a father. Miss Colton, that's all. He climbed back onto his wagon. The schoolhouse yard was brightening now. Dawn spreading across the snow. Other families would be stirring soon. Dean wanted to be gone before they arrived, before questions started, before his privacy eroded into public spectacle. Mr. Brennan, Sarah's voice stopped him. Thank you for believing education matters this much. Dean nodded once, then clicked to his horses. By noon, the whole town knew. Dean heard it in the general store where he'd gone for cornmeal. Voices quieted when he entered. Harold Finch, the store owner, looked at him with something between admiration and judgment. I heard what you did. Brennan, giving half your wood to the school. News travels fast. Poor planning masked as charity, if you ask me. Finch shook his head. What happens when you run out? You'll come begging from the rest of us. Won't be begging from anyone. But other voices were kinder. Emma Garrett's mother stopped him on the street, gripped his hand with rough gratitude. My girl gets to keep learning because of you. God bless you. Mr. Brennan. The Miller twins' father nodded respect as Dean passed. The widow Peterson smiled from her porch. That afternoon, smoke rose from the schoolhouse chimney again. Steady, strong. Dean watched it from his cabin window as he added a single log to his own meager fire. Thomas would be warm. 20 children would be learning. The arithmetic had changed, but the answer felt right. The cabin grew genuinely cold over the following days. Dean closed off the bedroom, moved their bedrolls to the main room near the stove. They heated only the kitchen now, letting the rest of the house freeze. Thomas never complained. He wore his coat indoors, wrapped in his mother's quilt while doing homework. His breath misted as he practiced multiplication tables by the week fire. Papa, if we burn 2 cords a week instead of 3, how many weeks will our wood last? Dean smiled despite the cold. You tell me. Son, that's division. Thomas's face scrunched in concentration. We got 30 cords left. Divided by 2. That's 15 weeks. We only need 7 more weeks till April. There you go. See, you're already smarter than me. No, Papa. You knew we could make it. That's the smartest arithmetic. They developed new rituals. Meals simplified to hot cornmeal, beans, and coffee stretched thin. They went to bed earlier to conserve heat, huddled together under every quilt they owned. Dean told stories in the darkness, and Thomas practiced his numbers. Chief, if 20 children each learn 5 new things a day, how many new things get learned in a week? Dean lay still, trying to calculate. His mind moved slowly through the figures. Thomas answered before he finished. 700. Papa, 20 times 5 times 7 days. Pride and regret twisted together in Dean's chest. His boy had gifts he'd never possess. The sacrifice was already bearing fruit. 3 days later, Thomas brought home a loaf of bread. Miss Colton says she made extra. Says it'll spoil if we don't eat it. Dean recognized the kindness for what it was. A week after that, a jar of preserves arrived the same way, then a sack of oats, before the mice get to it. Sarah Colton was preserving his dignity while easing his burden. Dean accepted the gifts with quiet thanks, understanding the grace behind them. At school, Thomas thrived despite arriving cold each morning. Sarah reported that he was her best mathematics student, that he helped younger children understand concepts. The boy had a teacher's patience, a gift for explanation. He makes multiplication make sense. Sarah told Dean one afternoon when he picked Thomas up. Most children memorize. Thomas understands. She stood in the schoolhouse doorway, the heat from inside spilling out around her. Dean stayed in the cold, hat in his hands. You're doing fine work here. Miss Colton, I'm only teaching what they're ready to learn. Your son is ready for much more than I can offer. He should go to secondary school someday, maybe even university. Dean's throat tightened. That costs money. It costs nothing to have the ability. Mr. Brennan, the opportunity will come if we keep the foundation strong. She gestured back into the warm schoolhouse. That's what you made possible. That night, Dean woke to bitter cold. The fire had burned too low. He added wood carefully, rationing even in darkness. Beside him, Thomas slept curled tight, breathing steadily. Dean did the mathematics again. At current rates, they'd make it. Barely. But they'd make it. He just had to hold faith a little longer. Outside, wind howled across the frozen plain. Inside, a father kept watch over his sleeping son, counting days until spring. The cold snap arrived without warning in the second week of March. Imbainivsa. Temperatures plummeted 20 degrees below normal. Dean woke to frost thick on the inside of the windows. Ice in the water bucket. The wood burned faster. Physics didn't negotiate. Colder air required more heat. More heat required more fuel. Dean recalculated daily. His careful rationing crumbled against reality. At current burn rate, they'd run out 10 days before April thaw. 10 days. An eternity in Montana winter. Thomas developed a cough, first just at night, then persistent. The boy tried to hide it, muffling the sound in his quilt. But Dean heard. Every racking cough felt like an accusation. You need to stay warm. Son, I'm fine. Papa. Just a tickle. But Thomas wasn't fine. His cheeks were too flushed, his eyes too bright. Dean added an extra log to the fire, watched his calculations crumble further. In town, the pressure mounted. Harold Finch made his opinions public at the general store. Man's being reckless with his own boy's health. All for pride. Should close the school, get his wood back before the child gets pneumonia. Others defended Dean, but their voices were quieter. The Garretts, the Millers, families whose children were thriving in the warm schoolhouse while Dean's son coughed through cold nights. Sarah Colton came to the cabin on the third day of the cold snap. Lindoshta. She brought a basket with soup and bread, but Dean saw the worry in her eyes when she heard Thomas's cough. Mr. Brennan, please. The school can give back what you need. We'll close early. The children will understand. No. Dean's voice was firmer than he felt. Those children are learning. Thomas is learning. We'll manage. Thomas is sick. He's got a cough. That's all. But that night, the cough became something worse. Thomas's fever spiked. He shivered despite the fire. Despite every blanket Dean piled on. His breathing came shallow and rapid. Dean burned the last wooden chair. He split it with shaking hands. Fed it piece by piece into the stove. Extra heat. Anything to break the fever. Papa. Thomas's voice was small in the darkness. Am I dying? No. Son, no. You're just sick. You'll be fine. I don't want you to give back the wood, even if I'm sick. The other kids need to learn. Dean pulled his son close. felt the fever burning through the thin body. This was the cost he hadn't counted, the arithmetic that mattered more than any calculation. You rest now. Morning will be better. But Dean didn't believe it. He sat awake all night, holding Thomas, praying to a God he'd neglected for years. The cabin was desperately cold. The woodpile outside had maybe 12 cords remaining. Not enough. Not nearly enough. At dawn, Thomas's fever broke. The boy's eyes opened clear. His breathing steadied. He was weak but alive. Dean made his decision. Pride had its place, but survival came first. He'd go to the schoolhouse that afternoon. He'd ask Sarah quietly for some wood back. She'd understand. Everyone would understand. He'd tried. He'd failed. Simple as that. Dean dressed in the cold morning, prepared to taste defeat. Dean drove to the schoolhouse expecting humiliation. Instead, he found 6 wagons in the yard, families gathered with wood stacked in their beds. He pulled his wagon to a stop, confused. Emma Garrett's father was unloading cords behind the building. The Miller twins' parents were stacking alongside him. The widow Peterson was there. Even Harold Finch, his face red with shame and cold, carried an armload toward the growing pile. Sarah Colton saw Dean and walked over, her expression calm, but knowing. What's happening here? Community. Mr. Brennan, that's what's happening. I don't understand. You showed us what one person can do. We decided to show you what a community can do when it wakes up. She gestured at the families. I visited each home this past week. Didn't mention your name. Didn't ask for anything specific. Just asked a simple question. What is education worth to you? Dean climbed down from his wagon, moved closer to the gathering. Emma's mother saw him and smiled. Mr. Brennan, your boy feeling better. Heard he'd taken sick. Fever broke this morning. Thank the Lord. We brought 2 cords. Figure it's the least we can do. The Miller father approached next. 1 cord from us. Our boys can read full sentences now because school stayed open. That's worth firewood. Even Harold Finch came over. Couldn't quite meet Dean's eyes. Half cord. And a sack of flour for your boy. I was wrong. Brennan, you weren't being foolish. You were being faithful. That's different. Dean's throat closed. He couldn't speak. Sarah touched his arm gently. You didn't just give wood to the school, Mr. Brennan. You gave the community a mirror. Showed us we'd been letting one man carry what we should all bear together. Education belongs to everyone. Supporting it should too. I didn't mean to. I know you didn't. That makes it more powerful. You acted from conviction, not to make a point. But the point got made anyway. Families continued unloading. The woodpile behind the schoolhouse grew. Dean watched, overwhelmed. As his private sacrifice became public catalyst, the widow Peterson approached last, placed a weathered hand on his arm. My late husband always said the best teaching happens outside the classroom. You taught this whole town something important. Mr. Brennan, thank you. By afternoon, Dean's wagon was loaded with wood donated by grateful families. More than he'd given. Twice as much. Maybe the arithmetic had changed again. But this time he hadn't done the calculating. He drove home slowly, watching the sun break through afternoon clouds. The temperature was rising slightly. The worst of the cold snap was passing. At home, Thomas was sitting up, still weak but smiling. Papa, did you get the wood back? Better than that. Son, I got something I didn't know we needed. What's that? Dean looked out the window at the wagons of wood, thought about the families who'd gathered without being asked, about a teacher who'd moved hearts with a simple question. Community. Thomas. Real community. The kind that works both ways. Hard that evening. Dean stacked the gifted wood with care, teaching Thomas to help. Each cord represented not charity, but reciprocity. Investment returned. Faith rewarded. Papa, this is multiplication too. Isn't it you gave one thing, got back more? Why, the smartest thing you've said all week. Son, they worked together until the pile stood tall and secure. More than enough to reach April, more than enough to reach May if needed. Inside, Dean built up the fire without restraint, for the first time in weeks. The cabin warmed. Thomas's cough eased further. The boys sat by the stove doing mathematics homework, while Dean prepared a real supper with the flour herald Finch had provided. Outside, the sun was setting later now, days lengthening, ice dripping from roof lines at noon. Why? Spring was coming, carried on the backs of a community that had learned to multiply generosity. Over the next 2 weeks, Dean's woodpile grew beyond anything he'd stockpiled alone. Families brought steady supplies. Not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet consistency. A quarter cord here, a half cord there. Parents who wanted their children to know that education had value, that sacrifice had meaning. Dean accepted it all with the same dignity he'd shown in giving. He learned that receiving could be as important as providing. That community wasn't about self-sufficiency, but interdependence. Thomas's health returned fully. His cough disappeared. He grew stronger on the better food that came with the flour and preserves. The occasional eggs and bacon from grateful families. At school, the boy excelled. Sarah reported that he'd moved beyond basic multiplication into more complex arithmetic, division, fractions, early geometry. The boy's mind worked in mathematical patterns that delighted his teacher and amazed his father. On a mild afternoon in late March, Sarah Colton visited the Brennan cabin. She came on foot, carrying a book under her arm. Mr. Brennan, I wanted to speak with you about Thomas. Dean invited her inside. The cabin was warm now, comfortable. He offered coffee, which she accepted. Thomas is ready for advanced mathematics, Sarah said, setting her cup on the table. Oh. Beyond what I can teach in a one-room schoolhouse with 20 students of different ages. He needs proper secondary education. That's years away. And expensive. Yes, but not impossible. There are teachers' colleges in Helena. Some offer scholarships for gifted students. Thomas could qualify, if we prepare him properly. She opened the book she'd brought. I've been writing to the Territorial Education Board. They're interested in supporting rural students with exceptional ability. Dean stared at the book, at Sarah's earnest face. You've been doing this for my son. For education. Mr. Brennan, for what it can become when we invest in it. She smiled. You taught me that. You sacrificed your comfort because you believed Thomas deserved his chance. I'm doing the same thing, just in a different way. I don't know how to thank you. You already did. You showed me what this work means. I came from St. Louis thinking I'd teach for a year, then returned to civilization. Now she looked around the simple cabin, out the window at the Montana landscape. Now I can't imagine leaving. This is where I'm meant to be. They talked for an hour. About Thomas's future, about the school's needs, about the community that had formed through crisis. Dean found himself speaking more freely than he had with anyone since his wife died. Chang. Sarah listened with the same careful attention she gave her students as she prepared to leave. She paused at the door. Mr. Brennan, the community is planning a gathering next week. End of school year celebration. They want to honor what you did. Thank you publicly. That's not necessary. Perhaps not. But people need to express gratitude. Let them. After she left, Dean sat with Thomas, watching the boy work through mathematics problems that looked like foreign language to him. Wow. Son, Miss Colton says you could go to secondary school someday. In Helena. I'd be door. Thomas looked up, eyes wide. Really? Papa? She's working on it. Says you got the kind of mind that needs proper training. Would you come with me? Dean's heart clenched. Don't know. Son, that's a long way off. But wherever you go, whatever you do, you'll have what I never had. Education. Understanding. Doors that stay open. Thomas set down his pencil. Papa, you're the smartest man I know. I'm not. You are. You knew the arithmetic that mattered. You knew giving the wood was right. Even when it was hard. That's smarter than any mathematics. Dean pulled his son close. Felt the sturdy warmth of him. Healthy and strong and brilliant. Outside, the woodpile stood abundant. The school thrived. Spring was arriving on schedule. Everything had worked out better than any calculation could have predicted. Not because of planning, Dean realized. Because of faith. Because of community. Because sometimes the best arithmetic was the kind you couldn't write down. April arrived with genuine thaw. Ice became water, became mud. The world softened, transformed, promised renewal. Dean stood at his window on the first morning of the new month, coffee in his late wife's cup, watching the sun rise over land no longer frozen. Behind him, Thomas worked at the kitchen table on advanced geometry problems Sarah had given him. The boy's pencil scratched steadily across the slate, confident and sure. Papa, come see this. I figured out the angle calculation. Dean joined his son. Looked at the marks that might as well have been Greek. But Thomas explained. Patient as any teacher. Breaking down the logic until even Dean could glimpse the pattern. You're going to go far, son. Farther than I ever could. We're going together. Papa. Just like with the wood. The community gathering happened on a Saturday. Families bringing food and gratitude to the schoolhouse yard. Tables were set up outside in the warming weather. Children played, while adults talked and laughed. Sarah Colton organized the event with quiet efficiency, but she made sure Dean knew this wasn't about spectacle. Just neighbors thanking a neighbor, she assured him. Harold Finch approached first, gruff but sincere. Brennan, I was wrong about you. You showed me what it means to invest in something bigger than yourself. I am grateful. No hard feelings. More than that, I'm putting my name down for the school board. Figure if I'm going to criticize, I should help fix things properly. The Garretts presented Dean with a smoked ham. For next winter. You'll be better stocked than any of us. The Millers offered preserved vegetables. The widow Peterson had knitted warm socks for both Dean and Thomas. Like Kleinau, each gift came with the same message. Thank you. You reminded us what matters. Thomas played with the other children, healthy and happy, teaching Emma Garrett how to calculate the angles of their game. The boy was a natural teacher. Dean realized. Patient. Clear. Gifted not just with numbers, but with sharing them. In a charity ball, Sarah found Dean near the end of the gathering. As families were packing up, Mr. Brennan, I wanted you to know The Territorial Education Board approved preliminary scholarship consideration for Thomas. Jois de Dextadai. If he maintains his progress, he'll have full support for secondary school in 3 years. 3 years? Dean shook his head in wonder. Seems impossible. Ain't body stay. Nothing's impossible when a community decides to invest. You proved that. They stood together watching the children, watching Thomas explain geometry to his peers using sticks in the mud. Will you really stay? Dean asked quietly. In Montana. I will. I've found my calling here. These children, this community, it matters more than anything I left behind. She glanced at him. Some things are worth the sacrifice. Dean understood she meant more than teaching. That, perhaps, in time, there might be other conversations, other possibilities, but those could wait. For now, this was enough. That evening, Dean and Thomas walked to the woodpile together, the boy carrying his slate with new problems to solve. Papa, can I ask you something? Always. Eiger, betiber boispi. Why did you give the wood, really? Dean thought carefully. Because you said something. Son, you said you were just starting to understand multiplication. Those words told me everything. Understanding is the most valuable thing in the world. Worth any price. But you were cold. We both were. We were. But you kept learning. And that warmth, the warmth of understanding, that lasts longer than any fire. Thomas nodded, processing, then smiled. That's poetic. Papa must be learning it from somewhere. They stood before the abundant woodpile, stacked twice as high as Dean's original count. The boy's pencil moved across his slate, calculating volume, estimating chords, practicing the mathematics that came so naturally to him. Papa, this is multiplication too. Isn't it you gave something, and it came back bigger? Tenfold. Son, that's the arithmetic of community. That's the kind of multiplication that matters most. Dean placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, looked out at the schoolhouse where smoke rose steady and strong from the chimney. Beyond it, the Montana landscape stretched toward spring, toward summer, toward futures. Neither of them could fully calculate. But they could have faith. They could invest. They could trust that giving freely meant receiving abundantly. Some folks measured wealth in gold or land. But Dean had learned the real currency knowledge passed on. Community built up. Sacrifices that returned tenfold. That was arithmetic that never failed. That was the kind of multiplication that mattered. The cabin was warm. The school was warm. Spring had come, and somewhere, in the gathering dusk, a father and son stood together, counting blessings instead of wood, understanding that the best mathematics couldn't be written down, only lived